The Los Angeles courtroom was buzzing. Tension hung heavy in the air, almost palpable, as if the very atmosphere was twisting under the expectation of what was to come. Murmurs in the gallery were incessant, onlookers leaning forward, attentive to every movement. Judge Walter Grayson, a veteran of the legal system, observed from his chair with a look that blended curiosity and disbelief. He was about to sentence a young man, but he didn't know that this boy was about to turn the tide in his favor in a way he could never have foreseen. Jalen Dawson, 19, stood before him, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Despite the gravity of the charges, the judge seemed to treat the case as a formality, a simple exchange of words to mark a swift judgment. The defendant's bench seemed too large for the young man, who remained standing, hands in his pockets, chin slightly raised, as if defying authority without uttering a word. Jalen was there to fight for his freedom, but not with the brutality of a warrior, rather with the cunning of a strategist. Grayson watched curious as Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington began his address, brimming with confidence. The man was prepared, his suit impeccable, and his voice, though controlled, held the same assurance of someone who had won countless courtroom battles. He spoke of the theft of an Audi A6, stating that Jalen was caught behind the wheel, following a tumultuous chase through the city. The case seemed straightforward. The defendant was in the stolen vehicle, his fingerprint was on the steering wheel, and the police pursuit confirmed his guilt. Jalen didn't react to what seemed like a crushing indictment. Instead, he simply observed, silent, waiting for the right moment. When Carrington finished, Judge Grayson gestured to the defense. The court awaited Jalen's lawyer's response. But that's when the first surprise occurred. "I'll represent myself, Your Honor," Jalen said, his voice clear and calm, as if he were about to give a lecture on the workings of the court, not defend himself against a set of serious charges. The murmur in the room instantly increased. Nobody expected that. The bailiff, the stenographer, and even the prosecutor stared at Jalen disconcerted. Grayson, however, remained impassive, a cynical smile playing on his lips. "You what?" Grayson asked, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose, as if assessing the young man. "I will defend myself," Jalen replied, firmer now without hesitation. Prosecutor Carrington laughed almost sarcastically, but the laughter quickly dissipated as Jalen took a step forward. The trial, which seemed to be a mere formality, was about to take an unexpected turn. "Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecutor," Jalen said calmly, turning his attention to Carrington. "Go ahead," Carrington replied, still with an air of superiority, crossing his arms. Jalen didn't rush. He took a slow step towards the prosecutor and spoke precisely. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel of the car prior to my arrest, correct?" "Yes, of course," Carrington replied, without paying much attention to what was being said. Jalen nodded slowly. "And his deposition report is on record?" "Yes, it's in the proceedings," Carrington confirmed, already beginning to seem impatient. "Then, Your Honor," Jalen turned to the judge, "I request the exclusion of this testimony as evidence." The courtroom fell silent. Grayson looked at Jalen with a confused expression, while Carrington appeared almost offended. "On what grounds do you base your request?" Grayson asked, intrigued, but without losing his air of authority. Jalen was unfazed. He pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time, pointing towards the prosecutor's table. "Officer Ruiz wasn't on duty the night of the pursuit. He couldn't have seen me behind the wheel. In fact, he wasn't even in the area. I'd like to request verification of the officer's GPS records that night. If he was where he said he was, that data should confirm his location." The courtroom began to murmur. Judge Grayson, though more cautious now, looked from Carrington to Jalen. "Any objection to verifying the officer's GPS records, Mr. Carrington?" Grayson asked. Carrington hesitated, looking down at his papers as if searching for some way to refute the request. The silence in the room was thick, and Grayson began to sense something wasn't right. The prosecutor was avoiding a direct confrontation. After a long moment of hesitation, Carrington finally replied, "No objection, Your Honor." But for Jalen, it was already too late. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted, the laughter had vanished, and a sense of uncertainty had overtaken the room. The prosecutor, who had been so confident before, now seemed slightly out of control. "While we await the GPS records, let's talk about the fingerprints found on the steering wheel of the vehicle," Carrington said, attempting to regain his composure. "The evidence speaks for itself." Jalen, however, didn't yield. "Yes, the fingerprints were there, and that's a fact. But let's stop and think for a moment," he said, turning to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe I stole the car simply because my fingerprints were on the steering wheel. But let me offer an analogy." He looked to the judge before continuing. "Let's say you go into a shop, try on a coat, put your hands in the pockets, maybe even the zip, and then put it back on the shelf. Later, someone steals that coat. Now, if the police find your fingerprints on the coat, does that make you a criminal?" The room was in absolute silence. Jalen was clear, direct, and unassailable. He looked at the judge. "I think everyone understands the analogy. I touched the car, but that doesn't make me responsible for any theft." Carrington was visibly uncomfortable now, trying to find some flaw in his case, but Jalen gave him no space to do so. "And speaking of which," he continued, "was the forensic specialist who analyzed those fingerprints called to testify?" The prosecutor didn't answer immediately, but his face said it all. He hadn't called the specialist. "So, how is the state intending to use this testimony without affording the opportunity for proper defense? How can I challenge the accuracy of a report that hasn't been validated by its author?" Jalen was in control now. The room seemed to be holding its breath. Grayson didn't know what to expect anymore. He had underestimated this young man, and now he was beginning to realize how profoundly he had been mistaken. And then the final bombshell. "I'd like to add to the proceedings an official statement from the vehicle owner," Jalen said, pulling a sheet of paper from his briefcase. Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker. He stated to the police that he'd left the car running at the petrol station. When he returned, the car was gone, and he said the thief wasn't me." The room erupted in murmurs. Jalen held up the paper, showing everyone the transcript of the original statement. He stated, "I saw the thief. He was a white boy. And that's the officer's version that was never presented in court. The prosecutor attempted to refute, but the evidence was too clear. Jalen had brilliantly exposed the case. He wasn't just an accused boy, he was a formidable opponent, and the legal system was beginning to realize it. Grayson looked at Jalen, finally realizing the depth of the mistake he'd made in underestimating him. The court now knew something was profoundly wrong with the case. There was no more laughter. Only the grim reality of a judicial system that, for a moment, was being challenged with the truth. The ensuing silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Eyes were fixed on Jalen, some filled with doubt, others with surprise. Judge Grayson rubbed his forehead, clearly disconcerted. Prosecutor Carrington, previously so self-assured, was now visibly shaken. The jury itself seemed divided, unsure of what to think. The case, which moments before had seemed a certain victory for the prosecution, was now at a turning point. The narrative was crumbling before them, and nobody knew how far Jalen might go. Grayson, attempting to regain his composure, made an impatient gesture with his hand. Right, let's proceed. Prosecutor, do you have any response to this?" He looked at Carrington as if searching for some explanation, something that could clean up the mess that was forming. The prosecutor, however, was in a moment of crisis. He flipped through his papers frantically, searching for something, but finding nothing that could counterattack. Carrington took a deep breath and, with a forced laugh, rose from his chair. "This is irrelevant, Your Honor. The fact is, we found the defendant's fingerprints in the car. There's no doubt he was inside the vehicle." His voice was lower now, less confident, but still attempting to maintain some authority. He tried to press on with an argument, but the foundation of his defense was disintegrating with every word Jalen spoke. Jalen didn't rush. He was controlled, calm, the opposite of the prosecutor, whose posture was now that of a desperate man trying to find a lifeline. Jalen looked directly at the jury, his eyes piercing, as if he wanted each of them to see the truth with absolute clarity. "Yes, my fingerprints were in the car, but that doesn't mean I stole the vehicle. As I mentioned before, a simple touch doesn't make someone a criminal." He paused strategically, allowing his words to resonate in the air. "If we're talking about physical evidence, let's be fair and consider all of it." He pointed at the prosecutor. "You claim my fingerprints on the steering wheel are enough to convict me, but the truth is, the car was parked in a public area outside a shop, and the owner had left the car running while they went into the shop. I'm not the only one who had contact with that vehicle. If someone by chance approached and touched the car, it wouldn't mean that person was the criminal. Crime is more than just touching something. Crime involves intent, deliberate action." Judge Grayson watched him, an expression of doubt mixed with slight frustration beginning to form on his face. He knew Jalen was right on many points, but still hesitated to accept what was unfolding before him. He looked to Carrington, searching for some form of resistance, but the prosecutor was more focused on trying to regain his dignity than refuting Jalen's arguments. "And the forensic analysis?" Jalen asked, without waiting for a response. The expert who processed the fingerprints wasn't even called to testify here, and that should be a crucial factor in any trial. How does the prosecution expect me to accept the evidence of something I can't directly verify? Grayson rubbed his eyes, beginning to realize how out of control the case was becoming. He had assumed, perhaps based on prejudice or the case's simplicity, that it would be a swift trial. But now he found himself facing a defendant who wasn't just defending himself, but attacking the weaknesses of his case with almost surgical precision. Carrington attempted to speak, but the words failed him. He was trying to formulate a convincing response, but everything he said felt feeble in the face of Jalen's clear arguments. Jalen then turned back to the jury. He knew his final gambit needed to be even more decisive, that he needed to convince each of them of his innocence beyond any doubt. "Finally," he said, his voice firm, "I wish to present crucial evidence that has been overlooked by the prosecution." He pulled another sheet of paper from his briefcase. "I have the transcript of the conversation between the officers and the vehicle owner, Mr. Whitaker. He clearly stated that the car was left running when he entered the shop, and that he saw the actual culprit, and that culprit was not me. He described the thief as a young white male." The courtroom was in shock. Judge Grayson seemed to have lost any doubt he may have had about the situation. Jalen's evidence was clear, irrefutable. Carrington, however, was in a state of denial. "This is irrelevant," he shouted, a little louder than usual. "This kind of statement doesn't alter the fact that the defendant was in the stolen vehicle. He was found behind the wheel." Jalen shook his head. "The evidence you have presented is not conclusive. The fact that I was in the car doesn't mean I committed a crime. The real culprit is still at large, and the only thing you have against me is assumption, not concrete proof." He paused, his voice lower now, but with an intensity that cut through the silence. "I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to show that the system cannot be used to convict someone without real evidence. The system should seek the truth, not the ease of a conviction." The murmurs in the room intensified. The jurors seemed to weigh every word Jalen had spoken, carefully considering each point he had raised. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but now there was a sense that the young man was, in fact, challenging the system itself at its core. Judge Grayson appeared to be considering what he'd heard with more attention than before. Carrington tried again, but his response was hesitant. "But the evidence is clear. The fingerprints—" He stopped, clearly unsure how to proceed, having nothing to directly refute Jalen's arguments. Grayson finally seemed to be reaching a decision. He looked at the jury, and then at Jalen. What had previously seemed like an absolute certainty of conviction was now transforming into a true battle of perceptions. The young accused had turned the tables, challenging the judge himself, the prosecutor, and most importantly, the judicial system itself. With a weary sigh, Grayson picked up the gavel. "We'll adjourn for now," he announced, his voice grave. "I need to review the evidence presented. We will reconvene shortly." But Jalen knew without a doubt that he had won. Not by the court's immediate decision, but because he had done something no one else expected. He challenged the system with the truth, and that was more powerful than any conviction. He looked out at the public, at the jury, and at the faces of others around him, and knew the battle was won. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for lies. He, a simple young accused, had done the impossible. What would happen next was uncertain, but the path to justice was now clearer than ever. The courtroom was in a state of suspension, and the tension in the air felt almost physical. People moved slowly, cautiously, as if everyone knew that what was happening there would be remembered for a long time. Jalen stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Judge Grayson, who was now examining the papers before him with exaggerated care. Prosecutor Carrington was back at his table, unsuccessfully attempting to reorganize his thoughts and the scattered documents, but his posture lacked its former confidence. What Jalen had done was unprecedented. He had defied everyone in the courtroom, without fear, without hesitation, and now they were all wondering what would come next. The judge, as expected, took longer than usual to return to the courtroom. When he finally entered, his expression was somber, but his eyes were sharper, more aware than the judgment of minutes before suggested. Jalen knew the judge's decision wouldn't be easy. He had not only questioned a police officer's testimony, but had also demolished the prosecution's main evidence with unassailable logic. Now, more than ever, the system was being forced to see Jalen as more than just a defendant, but as a challenger. Grayson took his position behind the bench, rapping lightly to gain everyone's attention. He took a deep breath. It seemed the weight of the decisions ahead was finally showing. "We will resume," he said, his voice grave, still reflecting on all he had heard. The courtroom, which had previously been charged with laughter and jeers, was now immersed in a quietude only a judicial crisis could create. The judge looked at Jalen, who didn't avert his gaze, and then his voice held an unusual coldness. "Jalen Dawson, you have claimed that your fingerprints in the vehicle are insufficient to sustain the charge against you. You have also questioned the integrity of the police officer's statement and brought to light the testimony of the car owner, which clearly contradicts the prosecution's claims." He paused, observing the reactions in the courtroom. Prosecutor Carrington was tense, his lips compressed, and Jalen remained calm, as if knowing the hardest part was already done. "The case is far from resolved," Grayson continued. "I will need to consider each piece of evidence before reaching a decision." Jalen nodded slightly but said nothing. He knew that any further words could be a mistake. His strategy was simple: to keep the focus on the prosecution's failings and let the judge do the work he should have done from the start. The silence that followed was palpable. The judge shuffled the papers with almost unnatural concentration, while Carrington, still in shock, tried to find something to react to. For a moment, Jalen felt a wave of certainty wash over him. He had studied the system, he knew how it worked, and more importantly, he knew how to expose its flaws. The confidence with which he had presented himself in court wasn't something that had sprung from a moment of youthful arrogance, but from meticulous preparation, from years of watching his mother, a paralegal, work and teach him the intricacies of the law. He knew that the truth, however much they tried to ignore it, would always prevail. When Grayson finally looked at him, his eyes were sharper, more critical, as if he had somehow recognized the astuteness and courage of the young man before him. "You understand the weight of the charges against you, Jalen?" he asked, now graver, less cynical. Jalen didn't hesitate. "I understand, Your Honor, but what you don't seem to understand is that the facts are being distorted here. The prosecution is based on assumptions, not evidence. I'm not guilty of what I am accused of, and that is what I'm trying to prove." The judge sighed, clearly weary, but also respectful of Jalen's assertiveness. He had seen many defenses in court, but few like this one. "Very well. The court will require more time to deliberate on the arguments presented. This may take a few days, but before any final decision, we will hold one last hearing." Murmurs started again in the courtroom, but Jalen remained impassive. What would happen next was crucial. He knew that to secure his freedom, he needed to stay focused, remain calm, and ensure that the truth wasn't overshadowed by personal interests or ego on any side. The judge indicated that the session was adjourned for the day, and everyone began to rise. Carrington was the first to leave, his expression now angry, but also disconcerted. Jalen, on the other hand, felt that the biggest challenge was already overcome. He had played his cards precisely, and now the system would have to deal with the consequences of its mistakes. As he approached his lawyer, Lisa Thornton, she still seemed astonished by his decision to represent himself, but she was also beginning to realize how decisive it had become. "Jalen, you made this happen. Now we just have to wait," she said, her voice a little shaky, but full of respect. Jalen gave a small smile. "It wasn't about waiting, Lisa. It was about doing what's right. They were trying to convict me on nothing, and I just needed to show them that." He looked at the courtroom door, which was closing behind him. "I know we still have a long way to go, but the truth has never been clearer." Those words were being said to more than just Lisa. They were for everyone there, for the prosecutor, for the judge, for everyone who witnessed that trial, and especially for himself. Jalen knew that this moment, this fight, would change his life forever. But what struck him most was that he hadn't won only because of his impeccable defense, but because he had broken down the barriers of the system. He had made people stop and think genuinely about what was really happening there. In the following days, the court filled again. The hearing was scheduled, and Judge Grayson, now more introspective, returned to his seat with a different weight on his shoulders. Jalen Dawson's trial wouldn't be simple, but he had already cast a very real doubt on the accusations surrounding him. The fight was only just beginning, but Jalen knew that in a court where the truth was challenged, he had somehow already begun to win. And as he awaited the final verdict, he knew that his journey, however difficult, already had more impact than any judicial decision could represent. He had shown the world that a young man could stand up against an entire system, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real victory. The following days were an emotional roller coaster. Jalen spent the first few hours after the hearing in a state of unusual calm, as if the weight of his defense had completely dissipated. He knew the court would still need time to deliberate, but he couldn't help but feel that the game had irreversibly changed. The confidence with which he had presented himself in court now reverberated in his mind, fueling his determination. He had done the impossible. He had exposed the flaws in the prosecution's case and shown the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury that the system could be manipulated, but the truth would always be his ally. Newspapers began to report on the case, and soon Jalen Dawson's name spread, with headlines ranging from praise for his courage to speculation about the impact of his defense. He became a symbol, a person who dared to challenge the system with a simple gesture of sincerity and intelligence. Some saw in his words an example of resistance, while others tried in every way to discredit him, arguing that he was just an arrogant teenager who had been lucky in court. However, for Jalen, what really mattered was what was happening in court. He didn't care about the headlines or how the public perceived him. What he wanted, and what he knew he deserved, was justice. And with each passing day, he felt closer to it. The hearing was set, and he braced himself for what felt like the final showdown. In the defense office, Lisa Thornton sat with Jalen and reviewed the evidence once more. They knew Judge Grayson would need time to process everything that had transpired. But now, the scales seemed to be tipping in Jalen's favor. The evidence from the vehicle owner's testimony, the flaws in the police officer's account, and the inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence were starting to weigh heavily. Jalen was aware of this, but he also knew the prosecution wouldn't give up easily. Carrington, with his arrogance and self-assuredness, wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. Lisa looked at Jalen and, with an expression of respect, said, "I never thought I'd witness something like this. You really turned the case against them." She smiled faintly, still astonished by what Jalen had managed to achieve. "But now it's just a matter of waiting. The judge will make his decision, and I hope he does the right thing." Jalen nodded but didn't smile. He knew Lisa was right. Now all he could do was wait. But he wasn't merely awaiting the judge's verdict. He was reflecting on what he had learned throughout the process. The battle wasn't just against the judicial system. It was a fight against people's perceptions, against the notion that he was just another young offender, incapable of understanding the complexities of the law. He spent the following days alone, finding solace in his own reflections. He studied the details of the case, reviewing his statements in court and, most importantly, observing the impact his words had made. He knew this trial would change how people saw him, but what he truly desired was for people to start seeing justice differently, more humanely, more truthfully. Finally, the verdict date arrived. The courtroom was once again packed, the air thick with murmurs and whispers, as if everyone were anticipating the final judgment. Jalen stood, calmer than ever. He looked around, observing the familiar faces of Lisa, Prosecutor Carrington, and Judge Grayson, who now sat in his chair with a more attentive, focused look than before. Judge Grayson gestured with his hand, calling for silence. He looked down at the documents on his desk, and for a moment everyone seemed to hold their breath, anticipating the weight of his words. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, he began, his voice grave and serious, "This court has reached the conclusion that the charges against the defendant, Jalen Dawson, cannot be sustained. The defense presented sound arguments and evidence that convincingly refute the prosecution's claims. The inconsistency in testimonies and the lack of sufficient evidence to support the charges of vehicle theft and resisting arrest render the charges unsustainable. Silence was absolute. Nobody in the courtroom dared to breathe as the judge spoke. Jalen felt a wave of relief, but knew this moment wasn't just about personal victory. He was, in a way, winning for something bigger. He was breaking down the barriers of a system that, for so long, had failed in many cases like his. Grayson continued, his voice softer now. For these reasons, I find the defendant not guilty of the charges brought against him. He is free to go. He banged his gavel, concluding the trial. The room erupted in a mixture of reactions. Some people seemed surprised, others relieved, and still others, especially those on the prosecution side, looked incredulous. Jalen couldn't believe what he was hearing, but at the same time, a feeling of justice finally being served completely filled him. He had won. Lisa approached him, her eyes shining with emotion. You did it, Jalen. You really did it. Her voice was almost choked with surprise and pride. Jalen didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, absorbing what had just happened. It was hard to believe that a simple action, the choice to defend himself, had led to such a huge turnaround. But he knew that that decision, that moment of courage, had irrevocably shaped the future. I just did what was right, Jalen said with a small smile. I believed in the truth, and in the end, the truth always prevails. They left the courthouse together, with the feeling that a new chapter was about to begin. Jalen knew his life would never be the same. He would no longer be just a marginalized young man, judged by his age or appearance. He would be recognized as someone who had defied the system and won, not by luck, but by the strength of reason. As they walked towards the exit, Jalen couldn't help but think about what the future held. He knew the fight for justice didn't end there. What he had done in court was only the beginning of something bigger. And more importantly, he knew that now he would no longer be invisible. He would be a voice, a presence. And that in itself was a victory that no one could take away from him. He knew his journey was only just beginning, and what awaited him, he had no idea. But of one thing he was certain, he was ready to face it. Jalen walked through the streets of Los Angeles with an unusual lightness. The courthouse was behind him, but the victory achieved still reverberated in his mind like a gentle echo that wouldn't cease. He looked around, seeing the world from a new perspective. The streets that had previously seemed indifferent to him were now laden with possibilities. The weight of the accusations that had haunted him for so long was now completely lifted. But Jalen knew that this feeling of freedom wasn't just about the acquittal. It was about what he had achieved, not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt wronged by the system. As he walked, he couldn't help but think of his mother, Denise Dawson. She had been the cornerstone of his knowledge, the woman who had introduced him to the world of law. Her story of dedication and sacrifice had always been with him, guiding him. But what he had just done in court wasn't just a reflection of what she had taught him. It was proof that he had finally stepped up. He was no longer the boy who listened to stories about the judicial system from his mother. He was now someone who had challenged that system and emerged victorious. His journey, which had begun with a desire to understand the law, now had a greater purpose. Jalen knew he couldn't stop there. The truth he had defended in court needed to be shared. He wondered how many other people around the country faced charges without having the chance to show the true failings of the system. How many others were dragged into a cycle of unjust convictions simply because they were seen as guilty before they even had a chance to defend themselves. He knew that, with his experience, he could help other people find their own voice in the midst of the chaos. But first and foremost, he wanted a moment to process everything that had happened. He headed to the place he always considered his sanctuary, the park. A walk around that tranquil lake, away from the pressures of the courthouse and the prying eyes of the media, was all he needed. He sat on a bench, watching the water reflect the surrounding trees. The sound of leaves rustling in the wind brought him a sense of peace, something he hadn't felt in weeks. Here, without the demands of the defense or the prosecution, he could simply be Jalen, not a defendant, not a symbol, just a young man who somehow had won. But something lingered in his mind, a nagging unease, the feeling that the fight was far from over. The truth about the judicial system and its flaws, which he knew so well, still needed to be brought to light. Jalen knew his victory wasn't a solution to all problems, but it was a starting point. He wanted to delve deeper into the issues he and his mother had observed over the years, the systemic errors, the failings of character in many within the system, the lack of empathy in so many involved in the judicial process. He wondered how he could effect lasting change, and more importantly, what he could do to ensure others didn't suffer the same injustice. His thoughts were interrupted by a message on his phone. It was a notification he'd been expecting, yet it still brought a surge of anxiety. It was an invitation for an interview with a prominent news network. The repercussions of Jalen's case had grown to such an extent that he was now seen as an influential voice on matters of justice. He didn't know exactly what this meant for the future, but he knew the road ahead was about to unfold in ways he'd never imagined. But Jalen had no illusions. He knew the system might try to protect itself, that some might try to discredit him, painting him as just a lucky young man. But he also knew the truth he'd championed in court had the power to spread. He was no longer a piece in a game. He was now part of the change. The wind picked up, and Jalen rose from the bench, adjusting his rucksack which he'd placed beside him. He looked at the lake one last time, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, knowing this was only the beginning. The world was about to know him in a way he'd never envisioned, but what mattered more than anything was what he would do with the opportunity he'd been given. Jalen returned to his apartment that night, no longer a young man accused, but someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of achieving. He sat at his desk, picked up a piece of paper and a pen and began to write. It wasn't a speech or a letter to the public. It was a journal, a reflection on everything he'd learned throughout his journey. He wrote about the moments of doubt, the difficulties of holding firm in court, and what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. He paused for a moment, looking at the words he'd just written, A sense of accomplishment washed over him. Perhaps it was too early to think about the future, but he knew what had happened in court wouldn't be forgotten. Jalen Dawson was no longer an unknown. He was a force to be reckoned with. In the days that followed, Jalen was approached by activists, lawyers, and even university professors, all eager to hear him speak. His case had become a symbol of resistance and justice, and he, an example of courage and wisdom. He had something to offer, not just as a young man who had challenged the system, but as someone who understood the complexities of the law, and more importantly, what it truly meant to fight for justice. In time, Jalen found his path. He knew he couldn't change the world all at once, but perhaps he could inspire others to stand up and question, to not accept injustice simply because it was easier. His journey had only just begun, and he was ready for it. He was prepared to go further, to challenge, to change, because ultimately he knew that true victory was when the truth prevailed. And so Jalen Dawson became more than a name. He became a movement. And the judicial system, once seemingly invincible, would now have to contend with a new reality. He had broken the chains of distrust, and there would be no turning back. The fight for justice was only just beginning.